Welcome everyone, I am Adesewa Josh and this is Africa Matters. Millions of Africans have been forced to flee their homes seeking safety, food, water and ultimately a better life. But contrary to popular belief, they actually remain on the continent. We look at what they're facing as they try to rebuild their lives. And on the flip side, there are those who choose to move abroad, benefiting not only their families but also their home country's economies. We'll focus on the hurdles they have to overcome to do this. The United Nations Refugee Agency says the number of displaced people around the world has hit a record high for a second consecutive year. The UNHCR says 110 million people are now forcibly displaced around the world, up from 108.4 million people last year. The increase this year has been driven by the Sudan conflict, as the total number of people fleeing war and violence continues to rise. The report also shows the world's low and middle-income countries host an overwhelming majority of the displaced. The UNHCR's High Commissioner, Filippo Grandi, says that 46 least developed countries, most of them in Africa, host more than 20% of all refugees globally. He called for global solidarity and funding to support such countries.
I think the prevailing rhetoric is still that all the refugees go to the rich countries. This is actually wrong. It's quite the opposite. 70% of the refugees, meaning of those 35 million, actually flee to the country next to their country. Most of them actually want to go back home. So there is a lot of, in these figures that seem a bit dry, that tell a story that is so different from what we constantly hear, especially from some politicians.
Even though displacement and migration have increased in Africa since 2010, people are moving within the continent, not to rich Western countries. According to Africa Center for Strategic Studies, the record level of over 40 million African migrants represents a 30% increase, and the trend is expected to continue through the year. But Africa accounts for only 14% of the global migrant population, compared to 41% from Asia and 24% from Europe. So, where in the world are African migrants fleeing to? Only 3% of Africa's 1.3 billion people live outside their home countries, according to the International Organization for Migration. 80% of African migrants do not have an interest in leaving the continent, and economic migrants prefer to seek employment opportunities in neighboring countries. Egypt, Morocco, South Sudan, Sudan, and Somalia are the top 5 sources of migrants on the continent. And South Africa, Ivory Coast, and Nigeria are the top 3 destination countries for African migrants looking for a better life because they are strategic economic hubs for their respective regions. While Uganda, Sudan, Ethiopia, Chad, and Kenya are the top 5 countries hosting African asylum seekers and refugees, according to the UN in 2021. Some Africans are leaving the continent not because of conflict, but in search of a better life. In Zimbabwe, the health sector is facing a serious crisis as professionals led by nurses move abroad in droves. Official figures show more than 4,000 nurses have left the country in the past 2 years, triggering fears of a total collapse of the sector. Inflation also rose by 50% last year, and more people are now unable to afford the high cost of living. John Yashana reports from the capital, Harare.
A lifestyle of struggle, power supplies are erratic, and so Tracy Majola, who prefers not to be identified, uses dried maize cobs to make a fire and cook. Taps have run dry, and borehole water is the only other option. Dejected and demoralized, Tracy, a nurse, leaves for work.
Love is very hard, so as I have a family to feed and my salary is not very well, so I think living is the best answer now.
Nurses here earn less than $200 a month in a country where the poverty datum line is 3 times that amount. The World Health Organization recently condemned nurses' migration from vulnerable countries like Zimbabwe, but here it's unlikely to stop.
You can understand why the directive was made, but at a personal level, I think people have individual decisions to make. It's hard to think of the national interest when you yourself can't pay your own school fees and your children are looking at you when you've got rents, you've got a spouse, you've got extended family.
Government, however, sees the recruitment as sabotage by the West.
It's not fair that we train nurses and maybe we use up to $35,000 per year to train them, and doctors maybe $72,000 per year to train them. And we definitely want to say it's wrong to continue enticing our people.
But it's lifestyles like Tracy's that's driving them away. The cost of basic commodities are going up every day, and life continues to get harder and harder. Experts here say unless fundamental economic issues are addressed urgently, the exodus of nurses and other professionals are set to persist. John Yashanu, Africa Matters, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Some of the health professionals leaving the continent are ending up in countries like the United Kingdom. That's because the National Health Service there is increasingly reliant on medical staff recruited from outside the UK and EU. And newly released data shows over 1,000 doctors and nurses from Ghana joined the country's medical register in the last year. Lakwe Olarinoye has more.
The National Health Service is struggling. Staff are continuously going on strike, and the United Kingdom remains a hotspot for medical migration from Africa.
Coming over and working in the UK is very appealing to many doctors and nurses in Ghana, simply because the pay is better. There is a support system here. There are actually ways to advance yourself in this country. And also, if we look at the situation back home, it's not great.
Ghana has become the latest African country to see an increase in overseas medical recruitment. And Dominic is one of the medics who chose to make that move.
Not everybody is from a well-to-do family. So once somebody completes school and then they have to wait 10 months to get their salary, that puts some kind of this bad taste in their mouth when it comes to the work that they're doing.
But it's back home in Ghana where it's felt most. The continuous migration of medical staff is beginning to have a large knock-on effect on patients.
We are left in a situation where Ghanaian hospitals are failing. The infrastructure is poor. There is not enough money being pumped into the system. So people who are actually living in Ghana face great challenges. And I think that's an issue that we need to address.
Ghana is on the World Health Organization's list of 55 vulnerable countries. They all have low medical staff per head of population. In the UK, the Home Office holds what they refer to as their red list of countries to try to discourage systematic recruitment from these areas. But with an abundance of jobs adverts on social media, coupled with a dire economic situation, it means for many African medics, it becomes an enticing employment opportunity. Despite its increasing reliance from overseas to fill vacancies and attempts to try to limit immigration, the UK government gave Ghana, Nigeria and Kenya $18 million to help boost their healthcare workforces.
If you don't really know the reason why they're leaving, it's really hard to direct that money. And I do think that giving them money is good, but I think that they need to do the added research to find out why they're leaving, and then that money can be targeted.
But with just one doctor to 1,000 people in Ghana and other West African countries, there are now growing calls for some of Africa's leaders to tackle the exodus of medical staff across the region. Lape Olarinoye, Africa Matters, London.
Well, the United Kingdom is not the only destination for African migrants. Official figures show more than 40 million Africans are living in Europe, North America, and the Gulf states, and they send more than $100 billion home every year. A third of African countries rely on remittances for at least 4% of their GDP, and the money serves as a lifeline to many families, especially those who live in rural areas. So, where is the money coming from, and where does it end up? Egypt is among the top 5 countries to receive remittances globally. It also benefits the most in Africa, followed by Nigeria and Morocco, and all three account for 65% of the continent's remittances, according to the latest Remiscope report. Nonetheless, Africa is the most expensive region to send money to. It costs an average of almost $18 to send just $200, but this could change as more people get access to mobile phone remittances. And according to the UN's International Fund for Agricultural Development, around 75% of remittances are used to buy food, pay for housing, education, health, with the rest used as savings or investments, especially in rural areas. Now let's bring in Pedro de Vasconcelos, Senior Technical Specialist, International Fund for Agriculture Development. He joins me from Nairobi. Pedro, thanks for joining us on Africa Matters. $100 billion, that's quite a figure. And also it is double the development aid Africa receives. Is this every year, and is it used to develop African countries?
Yes, thank you for having me here, and actually allow me to correct you. It is more than twice global ODA to the continent, and in many cases you can include foreign direct investment to that number. So having ODA and FDA, you will still have a number lower than when migrants send back home $200 or 150 euros at a time, 10 to 12 times a year.
Oh, hold on. So it's more than $100 billion, and is this a year?
Absolutely. It's a year that Africa receives, and this has been actually double over the last decade. There's been an increase in 12% since last year.
Wow.
So it is a phenomenon that has been increasing every year. There's never been a drop since remittances have started to be accounted for.
But how significant is that? And could it be tapped into for, say, development projects, et cetera?
Very interesting that you say that. This is money, these are private flows. This is, as you said very well, money that it is to put food on the table, buy medicine and pay for education. If 75% of those flows, this $200 that you receive, that families receive, are to address their daily needs, 25% is either saved and invested. What we realize is that migrant families that receive these funds should be provided with more options to save and invest, because they are normally outside of the formal financial system. And this is where the real development opportunity exists, not to take the money away from them, give them more options to use it, be more resilient. And we have a lot to learn about that, because this has been happening already. And the post-crisis has shown us exactly this, how remittances, our remittance families were extremely resilient. More options to use their funds is what they need.
Yeah, you said we're learning a lot about this, which brings me to the question, are there other continents right now that have similar remittances structure, and how is it being leveraged? Because you know what, we could just lift those policies and perhaps African governments can benefit from whatever it has been done elsewhere.
Absolutely. Well, let me say, this is a global phenomenon. This is not just for Africa. Every single country in Africa thinks that their diaspora are doing that, and it is something specific. Every continent, Latin America, Asia, Europe, Africa, are the continents where remittances are received by citizens living abroad. The total amount is 647 billion with a B. That's the amount of remittances that middle and low income countries, or sometimes called developing countries, receive every year. And this increased by 5 or 10% a year, pandemic or no pandemic. Actually, during the pandemic, it increased. Wow. So in terms of crisis, this flows grows. This is in the next 5 years at the UN, we follow the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, that has an agenda till 2030. And if we calculate from today till then, the aggregated amount of remittances sent from families to their families back home will aggregate to $5 trillion. Wow. And I'd said it's slow because that's a lot of zeros to follow.
Absolutely. So basically, before I let you go, the question is, could it someday become an alternative source of borrowing for African governments, you know, instead of turning to the traditional international lenders?
This is maybe the most important question, and so I will be very careful in my answer. Okay. These are private flows. We need to leverage what is happening. Let's imagine what would happen if Africa would not have received 100 billion last year. If we can think for a moment. So one should not replace the other. I think is what we need to maximize this ongoing flow for IFAD, developing rural areas. We know that 40 billion, 200 billion, for instance, in the last week were invested in agriculture. So we need to be very careful in equalizing this to aid or official development assistance, because it is not. It is family members. But again, if we really provide, if we make it count more, we will really get even more development, because this is exactly what it does. As I said, imagine if 100 billion were not received last year in the areas where these flows count the most.
I
You can
can't.
imagine.
I really can't imagine what would have happened. Thank you so much, Pedro de Vasconcelos, Senior Technical Specialist, International Fund for Agriculture Development. Thanks for joining the program.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Across the world, millions of people are forced to flee their homes due to conflict, persecution, and climate change. But amidst the chaos and tragedy, a remarkable picture of humanity emerges as they try and settle into their host countries. Anne Masharia talks to people who are trying to do just that in Kenya's capital, Nairobi.
Christella Ndayisenga is from Burundi, and she's one of the many refugees rewriting their stories in host countries. She fled a land torn apart by violence in 2019, leaving behind a trail of shattered dreams.
I arrived in Tanzania from Burundi and I was arrested. I was detained for 2 weeks. While in Tanzania, I bribed a police officer and he released me. I then made my way to Uganda. I stayed in Uganda without a phone and I didn't know anyone until I met someone from my home country. While in Uganda, I found someone to smuggle me into Kenya and then reached Busia and stayed there for a week before finally arriving in Nairobi.
Christella was not the only one with the determination to seek refuge. Joy, an aspiring cinematographer, was forced to leave Rwanda by her father.
He wasn't a good person. Yeah, he wanted to sacrifice us, so we had to learn. Imagine you learn because your father don't want you to be alive.
Kenya hosts more than 500,000 refugees from neighboring countries, according to UN's Refugee Agency. 44% of them live in camps, while about 1 in 5 refugees live in urban areas. Jonas Ndayisenga started this center in the capital Nairobi 4 years ago to help refugees like him get vocational training so that they can become financially independent. They are honing their skills by using adversity to fuel their ambitions.
Refugees are actually human beings like any other person. The only difference is that they fled looking for secure place. Some of the times, most of them, they come here or in those countries, in the host countries, being that they were educated.
Many refugees say they find it difficult to get legal documents that recognize their refugee status, making it harder to get jobs and access basic services. But they can't afford to lose hope.
The narratives of resilience continue to echo through the hearts and minds of those who have borne witness. These stories of strength amid adversity serve as a catalyst for change, urging us to embrace understanding, compassion, and inclusion. Anne Masharia, Africa Matters, Nairobi.
Every year, the World Health Organization commemorates World Blood Donor Day on June 14th to raise awareness of the need for safe blood and blood products like plasma. Despite the fact that giving blood saves lives, few Nigerians tend to regularly do so. Angela Ochubaye has built a mobile application that is gradually increasing the pool of volunteers across the country, as Polom David reports.
45-year-old Friday Hanga is a regular blood donor. He is one of the few Nigerians who voluntarily donates blood to save the life of others.
If I do like 2 years.
If I stay away from blood donation for 2 or 3 years, I become dizzy and sick. I went to a hospital and I was told my blood level was high and I need to regularly donate blood to stay alive. That's why within a year, I visit the hospital, look for someone in need of blood, donate mine, and save a life.
And for Osayuki Omogun, donating blood makes her happy.
I have donated blood before to 3 individuals, and one was a sickle cell warrior, a cancer warrior, and also a victim of a road traffic accident. After donating, it was fulfilling because I felt like a superhero. Okay, I've helped this person, they don't have to give me anything in return.
But these 2 people are a minority. Laboratory scientist Stephen Danlami says a lack of knowledge leads to many Nigerians shying away from blood donation.
People see it as if they donate the blood, they may be faint, or seeing the blood gushing out of their body. Fear may come out of them. But if you have the right knowledge that if you donate blood, it's actually even at your own advantage.
World Health Organization says Nigeria needs an average of 1.8 million pints of blood annually to keep over 200 million Nigerians safe. But the country's agency in charge of blood donation, Nigeria's National Blood Service Commission, says it only collects about 500,000 pints of blood every year, leaving a shortfall of about 73.3%.
To increase the donor pool in the country, Angela Ochubayi set up a blood match service in 2019. She came up with the idea of using technology to connect voluntary blood donors directly to recipients who have gone through a life-threatening experience.
You're going to be given information regarding the units of blood that you need, the blood type that you need, the hospital you're in, the doctor in charge of the hospital, and why you're requesting for blood. The app uses that information to generate a message and now sends it to blood donors within the same location, and they can receive that message and come through to donate blood for you.
Almost 1,000 registered blood donors are now on the platform. But while the app is an innovative development, there are currently only 17 government-built blood donation centers across Nigeria. There's still a need to do more to change the culture around blood donation so that volunteers can come forward willingly. Palum David, African Matters, Abuja.
And this week, we explore Gao in eastern Mali. The city is one of the oldest trading centers in West Africa. It's a cultural melting point where diverse ethnic groups are reflected in the city's rich architectural heritage. Let's take a look. And that's our show this week. Kindly share your thoughts and suggestions about the stories you've seen on this episode, or ideas on what you would like us to cover on Twitter using the hashtag #AfricaMatters. Feel free to reach out to me and my personal handle. It's @Adesewa Josh. You can watch this episode and more on YouTube. Just search Africa Matters TRT World. Like, comment, and do not forget to share. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you next week.